Hi, this is your host, Bruce Cartwright, Chief Instructor of SAC Tactical. Welcome to the Fundamental Shootist Podcast, a place where the execution of the fundamentals leads to the mastery of the shooting craft.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Fundamental Shootist Podcast. My name is Will Cartwright, Assistant Instructor with SAC Tactical. Joining me today is my father, Bruce Cartwright. Say hi, Dad.
Hey, Will, how are you?
I'm doing all right. Today we're going to be doing a podcast on the unsung hero of the shooting world, the .22 long rifle. Why don't you cue us in on what do you think about it?
One of the cool things about the .22, and I've sort of rediscovered this lately, is with the high cost of ammo. When 9mm is, $300 to $400 a case for 1,000, you can go to Walmart and buy 1,000 rounds of .22 for like $65.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of training value in it. And for a long time, especially when I was in the Bureau, we very rarely used the .22 because you're trying to get people up to speed running 40 caliber handguns and then later 9s and 45s and on and on. And I understand that, but for the trained shootist, for somebody that is really looking to improve their skill level, or if they've hit a plateau, the .22 has a whole pile of advantages that a lot of people have forgotten about. And I'm here to say, we've reintegrated it a lot into our training world, into the stuff that you and I do. And I'm really excited about it because it gives you an opportunity to do some things and improve your performance for relatively low cost. And so, I knew this years and years ago when I first started shooting when I was 5 years old, sort of got away from it, and it's like, it's a really great tool to have.
The Bureau ammo train really helps when you want to shoot a bunch of somebody else's ammo, but when it comes time for your own pocketbook to actually start, cashing the checks on ammunition, .22 starts looking pretty nice.
Right.
Especially now.
And we'll get into some of the downsides of a .22, but the one everybody gripes about is it doesn't recoil like, a center fire cartridge. Thanks,
Correct.
Captain Obvious.
Yeah.
No kidding. There's ways around all that. That said, something that one of the guys I worked with, who shall remain nameless, said, and it's always struck a chord with me, is you can't cheat a .22. Either, and people need to understand, what is shooting? It is essentially holding a remote control drill aligned at a particular point in space and activating that drill without disturbing the alignment of the drill. And we talk about that in class. Well, with a .22, because there is no recoil, and you can get pretty decent triggers in those guns, if you mash the trigger or you don't have good follow-through, or more importantly, a good grip, you're going to miss. And when people sit there and miss with a .22, it's because typically they are not conducting the fundamentals properly. And from our perspective, I think the idea of, well, let me say this. What's the definition of a professional? And I've always thought this, and it tends to make sense. Amateurs do things until they get it right. Professionals do it until they can't do it wrong. And people talk about, Lou Auerbach talked about the idea when somebody asked him one time about taking an advanced class. He's like, so what's an advanced gunfight? And I really get back to the idea that an advanced shooter is somebody who has mastered the fundamentals of shooting and is able to produce or perform on demand. The way to get there is shooting a pile.
So
and the .22 lets you do that.
Here's a pretty good analogy for you folks, to have a better idea of why my father and I are so hot to go on .22s. Other than, we're kind of cheap and we really like, spending money on beer, whiskey, and other fun things other than just ammo. We like to multitask. So one of the reasons I'm such a huge fan is when 2020 opened up, the the pandemic kicked off. I was in school in Missoula, Montana, and realized that, if stuff really starts flying off the handle, I really probably shouldn't be in a city. So I disappeared. I was still in school. We were doing online classes, and I temporarily moved up to my parents and told my dad, I'm like, Dad, listen, I'm losing my mind, because at the time I'm trying to learn Chinese through Zoom calls, which is easier when you're in your second year, but it's still not fun. I'm losing my mind. And I'm like, Dad, I need something to do. I need something to do. And we talked about it for a little bit of things that I could improve and work on. And then I came to the conclusion, if I'm going to be an instructor, I need to be able to shoot better with one hand. And what's the best way to shoot better with one hand? One-handed bullseye. And so had a setup where just had a 6-inch steel plate, and I would just stand there at 25 yards, and I would just my dad handed me a 22 pistol and a box of ammo and said, here you go, kid, have fun. So I'd go out every day, and I don't even remember what my average for the day was, but I would go out every single day, and I would just shoot a couple of mags. And by the time 4 weeks rolled around, and I'm like, okay, the world's not actually ending, things are looking relatively safe, I can go back to my apartment. I had burned through probably north of 9,000 rounds of 22. When I started shooting, and understand this was every single day, I didn't take any breaks, because I had nothing else to do, and I really enjoyed it. I went from not really being able to hit a 6-inch head plate reliably at 25 yards to on command with a 1911 shooting a 2-inch square at 30 yards. Anytime someone looked at me and said, hey, you need to do it. That was just in 4 weeks and 9,000 rounds. I don't know about anybody else, but 9,000 rounds of 9mm? I don't have that kind of money floating around. 22, it's doable.
Well, think about it. 9,000 rounds of 9mm, if you assume $300 a case, that's $2,700.
Yeah, that kind of hurts.
That's a little pricey. 9,000 rounds of 22, and it was less when we bought that at the time. I don't know.
You're looking at what, $65 1,000, depending on where you find it, what kind you're getting.
So you're still looking at, let's say it's $65 1,000, and you had 9. So you're at less than 600. You're probably around $590. Less than $600 versus $2,700, and the amount of skill you picked up and the fundamentals that you ingrained in shooting with both hands, right hand only, left hand only, has paid huge dividends.
Huge.
And you get on that gun, you can start pressing the trigger, and you've trained yourself to just execute the fundamentals at a higher level. Which, when we get back to talking about the idea of the fundamental shootist, that's what you want to do. We want all of our readers or listeners to be able to execute the fundamentals at a higher level. We're always striving to do that. And I'm telling you, the 22 is a tool to do that. I mean, even if you had time, and even if you had the money, there's still a fatigue factor. I watch people when they shoot and they train in classes. People talk about wanting to go to high round count classes. That's great. I've done that. Pat Rogers, Carbine 2, the one I did in Great Falls, Montana. 2,800 rounds in 3 days. You're beat when you're done with that.
Yeah, you look like you look like a whipped puppy after that.
I've done classes for police departments. Like I did one at one point where we did 800 rounds of carbine ammo in a day. When the people are done, they look like they got run through the ringer. Loved the training, and it was great because we had a limited amount of time. We had to compress a bunch of time into it. But I don't care who you are. Any centerfire, you shoot that much, you're going to get tired.
Oh, yeah.
And especially when you see different people coming into the sport or not sport, but into the discipline where they're shooting, a lot of folks aren't used to that, and don't have the physical stamina. So 300 to 400 rounds of center fire is a lot for the average bear. When you can extend that with a 22 and get the fundamentals down, that's the real benefit of the 22. It doesn't beat you up, and so you can work on all of those things like sight alignment and trigger press.
Because with a 22, with a good trigger, realistically, when you're shooting bullseye or whatever discipline of marksmanship you're practicing, what do you really need to do to get hits? You need to have a good trigger press, you need to have a solid grip, and depending on the distances, you may need to learn to breathe better, and you might have to have a different stance. You can do all of that with a 22. You don't need a center fire gun to do that. When people ask me, I have a number of people that ask me, hey, what should my first gun be? Considering our current political climate, considering a lot of different things, my first answer is get what you can, preferably a 9mm or 5.56, because that's what's common. You can find 9 and 5.56. You're going to pay for it, but you can find it. But after that, my answer, they're like, hey, should I get a shotgun? Should I get, a bolt rifle? What should I get? A bolt action rifle. What should I get? And I'm like, get a 22. And I get a lot of weird looks. And I'm like, well, you have a rifle or a handgun to defend yourself. It gets real expensive. You really need to find a way to train and optimize your training. And any decent 22, there's plenty of companies now. I mean, let's say you ended up with an M&P 2.0, one of their more modern plastic handguns, they make a 22 copy that is dimensionally the same. It's only have 10 rounds of 22, but for what, $400 or $500 in the handgun, it fits all of your holsters, all of your mag pouches, and it's in a cartridge that you can go to Walmart once a day and buy 3 boxes of for less than $100.
Well, $65.
Yeah, $65. Like, it's way cheaper.
And you're hitting on something, and I still remember this from the days in the dojo studying Aikido. You're better to spend a little less training time, but do it more frequently. In other words, I've always been the opinion that if you have 500 rounds to train with, instead of doing that all in one day, like on a Saturday, you're better to do it, say, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and shoot 50 at a time. That gives you 10 days or probably a little over 3 weeks of training time if you work on the fundamentals, and it lets you stretch out the budget a bit. I mean, I typically, when I shoot, the course of fire I shoot with a handgun is about 80 rounds. And there's slow fire at 25 yards, strong hand, 10 rounds slow fire, strong hand, 10 rounds slow fire, support hand, and then I do, it basically looks like an FBI instructor bullseye, 2 strings of 5 rounds of rapid fire at 15. I do that 2-2-2 and 2 drill where you shoot 2 freestyle, right hand, 2 freestyle, left hand, 2 support hand only, 2 strong hand only. The point is, 80 rounds over 3 days, I mean, that's a brick ammo. That's $20, $21. That's a lot of training.
And not only is it a lot of training, but you're practicing the fundamentals, because does the 22 have the same recoil impulse as your typical carry gun?
Nope.
No. But at the end of the day, how long does it take for a person to get used to the recoil of a handgun? Not that long. I mean, maybe 100 rounds and you have it pretty well figured out. Like, it's not going to be a surprise.
Right.
And we're not saying to swap out all of your training to just 22 training, but you can cycle in the 22 for probably a good 80 to 90% of what you do, whether it's in a rifle or a pistol, and get very good results. You can do a lot of learning for a lot cheaper, and then go practice some speed drills or recoil mitigation drills to make sure that you're all squared up and ready to go. But
understand, the 22 is not a substitute for your training regimen. It's an augment. One of the things I see all the time is you see students that typically they'll come to class, they're running a handgun, and I don't care what it is, but you tend to see it more with striker-fired pistols, and they'll tend to shoot low and left. And you can diagnose that, and typically what it is they're accelerating the trigger, and or they're over gripping a pistol, and there's also some issues with some over travel in the triggers. And I'll tell you, how do I fix that? And part of it is you've got to be able to press the trigger straight back without disturbing the alignment of the sights. How do you get better at that? You got to shoot to 22. You got to shoot all these guns. But that also is another topic for another day, which is why single action auto pistols have some real benefits, and I think are due for a resurgence. I know it's a plastic world, but
but I'm just a 25-year-old with a FUD's brain. I will tell you, what 1911 is, 2 world wars, and it's still, in the words of Ken Hagethorn, the best fighting handgun on the planet. But then again, it's a plastic world, and that's what it is.
Right. And so but getting with the 22, what we're talking about for our listeners is typically we're running Ruger Mark II and now Mark IV semi-autos. Great. Those typically have pretty decent triggers, or ones you can get to, but they're a single action pistol. So let's say, how does that work? That's great, Bruce. I don't want to buy a Ruger Mark IV. Well, go buy a Smith & Wesson Model 17, which is the double action K-frame revolver in 22. You want to get good at shooting a revolver? Shooting a 22 revolver is another tool. You like to carry a J-frame airweight Centennial as a backup or a pocket gun? They make those guns in 22. Buy one of those as an understudy, and then shoot the dog snot out of it.
Beat it to death.
And when you put the gun in your left hand, because that's one of the other things I see students get into, is they're pretty good with two hands. They struggle shooting one hand only. When you tell them to put the gun in your support hand, they look at you like you got a tree trunk growing out of your head and that you're crazy. But there are times that you're going to need to learn how to run that gun in your support hand.
It's really common in shootings to see a lot of hand and arm wounds. Yes. Because a lot of folks, when faced with a lethal threat, will shoot to the threat, and they deem the gun as the threat, not the actual person that's wielding it. And so there have been, tons of different injuries related to gunfights where you see shooting hands, the primary shooting hand is wounded or injured to the point where you cannot shoot with this hand effectively.
Right.
Well, I'm not going to just give up in a fight, and that sometimes that's an option for people, and I think that's a terrible option. The next best option is, whoever you believe put you on the face of the earth gave you two hands. Just put the gun in the other hand and continue to go forth and lead a good life.
As an example of that, you're on the right path with that, Will. During the 1986 Miami shooting that the FBI was involved in, there were 8 agents that were involved in that shooting against 2 subjects. 2 of the 8 agents suffered arm and hand wounds. Gordon McNeil had his right hand hit with a .556 round and was on the ground trying to reload the revolver, and there was blood and bone and junk that prohibited him from reloading his revolver. And then Ed Morales, S.A. Morales, got shot in the left arm with a .556 round, and basically his left arm was completely out of function, out of service, and so he fought strong hand only. Now, yep, I understand. That's a statistical anomaly. Gunfights don't happen. But I also know that Murphy was a friggin' optimist, and not training with both hands seems like a dumb idea. And you and I are used to it because we come from the martial arts, the traditional Japanese martial arts thing, where you train with both hands. You don't do Shihonage with your right hand and not learn how to do it with your left hand.
You learn to fall with both your right hand side and your left hand side. You always learn to do everything both ways. And I found that, from my at least in the martial arts context, and I know this doesn't have anything to do with guns, and you're here to listen to gun stuff, but what I've found in the martial arts community is when I train exclusively with one side and I'm forced to use the other side, like I'm right-handed. So if I train and do something that I've never done before with my right hand on my left side, I look like a monkey doing unholy things to a football.
Right.
It is rough. It is ugly. But the moment I start doing both sides and I make it a stringent part of my training regimen to do right hand exercises just as many times as left hand, I find that I'm much more confident because it's just, oh, I've done this before. It's not complicated. You do the same thing with your left hand as you do with your right hand.
Well,
and you don't confuse your brain. You just do it.
And one of the things, and this is getting into left-hand stuff and a little off the topic of 22s, but one of the things I always did is I've suffered debilitating injuries to my right hand.
Same.
So I always had a complete rig set up. So if I carried, like when I worked at the Bureau, I carried a Glock 21 and a Summer Special. Well, I had a left-hand Summer Special made up for me by the fellas down at Milt Sparks, and I went through classes with that gun. And I would shoot at least one qualification and note it on Bureau documents every year so that I was, and the Bureau didn't care. You were qualified. But I wanted to be able to establish that I was qualified to carry a gun in a support hand position. And I just shot a match with some, sort of an impromptu match with some friends in northern Montana. And I shot it all left hand. And people looked at you and it's like, oh. Yeah, but it's just something that we do, and you're training that way. So, for those that are new to that, or those that decide that it's important to be able to use your support hand, again, the 22 is a tool that lets you focus on the fundamentals without a lot of blast and recoil, and get those memory pathways burned into your system so that you can shoot well with it.
Because what I've found is, like your friend said, you can't cheat at 22. Right. I can sit somewhere with a 45 and miss and go, oh, well, the recoil's too heavy. Are you going to tell me a 22 is too heavy? If you miss, it's because you're not executing the fundamentals the way they should be executed. And there is no lying, there is no cheating. You have to stand on the 2 yellow footprints and explain to yourself why you're missing.
Well, and then the psychological benefit of this is once you can achieve those hits right or left hand with the 22, then when you miss with a center fire gun, then this little creeping doubt crawls into the back of your brain housing group that says, hey, knucklehead, you didn't execute the fundamentals properly. Get back on your game, align the sights, press, wait for the shot to break.
The other kind of unusual benefit is when you pick up a completely new gun, whether it's somebody else's gun or a gun you just bought and you start shooting, you can immediately tell, once you've developed consistency in the fundamentals, you can tell, okay, this gun shoots low left. It's not me. It literally shoots low left. And then you go, well, you know what? To be sure, swap hands. Oh, hey, it's still shooting low left. There's no way I'm going to be driving. If I'm homping on the trigger, I'm not going to be driving it low left with my left hand. It's going to be going low right. Well, there you go. That's how you tell. Anyway, getting back to the 22, another benefit that I've been seeing, because I have a number of friends with suppressors, is suppressed 22s are amazing. They are fantastic training tools. If you want to, if somebody wants to shoot, but has a problem with loud blast or a lot of recoil, screwing a 22 suppressor onto a pistol, they start shooting and go, oh, it sounds like a BB gun. It's like, yeah, everything else from here, it just gets louder and more blast. But this is what shooting is, and its most base components.
Well, and again, it gets back to letting you focus hard. The lack of blast lets you focus hard on the execution of the fundamentals. And the more you do that, the better you're going to get. The other thing, though, is it means you're good to your neighbors. You can shoot 22s in a lot of places you can't shoot center fire.
With a can, because it's so quiet.
And with a can, you're not bothering anybody. You get a bunch of stuff done, work done. And in many places, especially in the West, you can shoot places where you can't shoot bigger guns.
Exactly.
Or you don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some benefit to that, I think. Just trying to think.
Plus, there's a tactical benefit to a 22. I'll have a lot of folks ask me, hey, what kind of gun should I get? And of course, that's like asking a car guy, hey, what car should I get? That's a stupid question. The question is, what are you going to be using it for? Oh, hey, I need to drive the Indy 500. Well, I'm not going to tell you to get a Toyota Sierra, one of the minivans, to go drive that. That's not a good idea. You need something very different. You need something with at least 200 horses. And it's the same in the shooting world. I've met plenty of folks that, for one reason or another, they want a firearm. They are terrified of the blast, where their hand strength is so minimal that being able to actually press a typical modern 9mm trigger or operating a 9mm gun is out. It's not going to work. A 22, well, you don't need a lot of spring power for a 22, and you can hand that gun to basically anybody, whether it's a revolver or semi-auto, and anybody can run one.
Well, one of the benefits there that you're talking about is for especially older folks that may be struggling with some arthritis or loss of hand strength that need a defensive tool. I mean, think about it. You get one of the Ruger makes something called that Mark IV 2245 Light. So it's an aluminum frame upper, a polymer lower that's like a 1911. It's got a manual safety, good sights that you can see, but it's light. And, for folks that are struggling with that, you can manipulate it easily. The safety gives you it's better than just having a striker-fired pistol with no manual safety. And for older folks, like I'm thinking about some of those folks that we knew that lived north of us, nice folks, but they're really, at this point in life, in their 80s, they're not going to get into shooting and spend the time and effort to get good with a Glock 19 or something like that. One of these guns would give them a level of defensive protection, and it makes sense.
Yeah, and I for a long time, speaking of self-protection with the 22, for a long time I used to poo-poo the 22 because it's a 40 grain bullet going at maybe 1,100-1,200 feet a second. That doesn't really do much to humans all that much. At least that was my opinion until I started talking to some folks. The Israelis, for a long time, when they needed to, we'll say, liquidate an enemy of their state, they would a lot of times engage targets, from their door to their car, and they would shoot them in the chest. And I mean, there's obviously no data; they don't talk about it that much, but I never heard of anyone actually walking away after getting shot 3 or 4 times with a 22.
Well, you look at what happened to President Reagan when the assassination attempt was made on him by John Hinckley. He got shot with 1 round of 22 and damn near died. The surgeons in the Secret Service
were on him.
Great things, and all those folks deserve huge credit. But he got 1 hit with a 22, and it was supposed to be an exploder round, and basically it ricocheted around inside his body, and it bounced off of stuff, and that's not good for a long-term prognosis of healthy living.
No.
So is it ideal? No. And people need to remember, any tool the bad guy always gets a vote in a fight, and any tool you have may or may not be up to the task. And as good as your tool is, it's still the nut behind the butt. The guy running the gun is the guy that's going to have to fight. And, a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about, is this the best round or that and all that. You're going to get what you're going to get. Do the best you can and drive on. And realize fights are dynamic things.
I had a friend that I was engaged, I was part of a conversation that was basically talking about the merits of different grain weights of 45 ACP bullets. One guy said, hey, 200 grains are magic. Another guy said, no, 230 grains are magic. No, and it just kept going back and forth, until one of the guys that was listening to the conversation, but not really in it, held up his hand and said, guys, listen, I talked to a buddy of mine that was a SEAL, and he said that every dude he shot in the face with 9mm NATO ball died. That pretty much ended the conversation. Because you can talk about grain weights all day, but until you actually, learn to fight better, you can use diminutive cartridges if you know what you're doing and still be very dangerous and very effective.
And even Jeff Cooper talked about people using the 22 in a defensive capacity. And what he said was, if you can place the rounds precisely, typically in human eye sockets, it was a great tool. And the fact that it's cheap and doesn't recoil much and you can practice with it, that's an option if you need to use it. And especially, we've talked about this, you had like one of these red dot optic sights.
Oh, yeah.
It makes it a lot easier to get hits with.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, too, is, even if you do, there's plenty of reports floating around with people getting shot in the head defensively or offensively. You see a lot of people that get shot in the head with handguns, they don't actually die. It's fairly uncommon, but it does happen. I've heard reports of guys that have been shot in the head. An ambulance shows up, picks him up. Okay, yeah, this guy's a corpse. Ain't no way he's alive. They throw him in the back of the meat wagon, start hauling him off somewhere, and they snap up on the table like, "Oh, what's happening?" And of course, the paramedics are having an aneurysm because they don't know what's going on.
That happened back east somewhere. A guy got shot in the head with 45 ball, and they just figured he was dead. And part of that is modern, better trained paramedics are always checking for pulses and stuff like that.
Yes.
So
the other one was Jimmy Cirillo. He shot, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to have to do my research, but he shot a guy. He was the first guy to shoot someone with Supervel. 38 Supervel was what, the 110 grain Supervel. And that's a story for another time, but he shot a suspect in the head and said, okay, yeah, this dude's toast. And so they start doing call-outs, getting the meat wagon there, and there's a bunch of cops there because they just had a shooting. They want everybody there to cover. And the dude that got shot just pops up and spits the bullet out. It hit him in the sinus, and he coughed it out.
I think that was a regular round, not a Supervel. But
maybe.
The point is, when you start, and we're getting off the point of 22s, but TV's a terrible instructor, and fights are statistical anomalies. You don't know what's going to happen in them, and the idea is to fight the fight. Fight the fight you're given and drive on, and expect the unexpected.
And what I was trying to get to, and I was working my way there, and I'm taking my sweet time to do it. But even if the bullet doesn't penetrate, you're more or less just hitting somebody in the head with a small ball peen hammer. Right. You do that 3 or 4 times, even if it doesn't kill them, even if it doesn't shut them off, you're getting hit in the head with a hammer. I wouldn't be terribly impressed with getting hit in the hammer. I really wouldn't like that.
Right.
So, even if it doesn't quite have the effect that you were looking for, it can still have a pretty decent effect. May not be what you expect, but it might be what you get.
Well, and and we've focused sort of on 22s and handguns, but like one of the things I like to do is, like, one of my favorite rifle drills is something Pat Rogers taught, was the modified Navy qual, which was start with your carbine, 5 rounds in it, you shoot 5 rounds standing, reload, 5 rounds kneeling, then reload and shoot 5 rounds prone in 25 seconds at a 50 yards piece of target. And most ARs in 22 don't have they don't lock the bolt open the same way. So what do? I mean, and it's sort of a way to minimize some of the issues, but I'll shoot the modified Navy qual with a 22 AR. I just won't do the reloads. I can aspect train and practice the reloads, dry fire, if I need to, so it's not a big deal. And so, there again, how do you compensate for some of this? Well, the modified Navy qual was shot in 25 seconds with the 2 reloads. Well, I'll shoot the qual at 50 yards with a 22, but shoot it in 20 seconds.
Yeah.
So there's ways to compensate. And usually it's either using a smaller target or reducing your times.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a little bit of thought. I mean, for example, you shoot the bullseye. One of the things I'll do, like if you shoot the FBI instructor bullseye, which has a stage where you're shooting 2 5-round strings in 15 seconds called time fire, and then 2 5-round strings in 10 seconds. You can cut that down with a 22.
Oh, yeah.
You may drop it a third or so, or cut it in half, whatever, and still it simulates having to deal with the reduced recoil like you're going to have to do with a centerfire gun.
Correct.
That said, I am not an advocate of students using 22s in class. Because quite frankly, they do have reliability issues. There are some really reliable 22s, but I find
it's the ammo.
That the ammo is variable enough that you still get misfires, you still have malfunctions, and the problem with using them in class is it slows everybody down. Now, I don't mind bringing a 22. A lot of times I'll throw that Mark IV into a range bag, and if a student's struggling with something, here, shoot this for a string, like from high ready or whatever, without a holster. Just shoot it to make sure you're getting back on the fundamentals and to help identify any issues with their execution of fundamentals. And so I'll use that. I've done that with the revolvers too. So benefits to it, and I would say there's far more benefits to shooting a 22 than there are disadvantages.
Oh, and I would agree. I mean, just from the cost analysis, accurate, because let's face it, really reliable, accurate 22 is very expensive. But for what you're going to get out of, like, say something like, Remington Auto Match, it's
Federal Auto.
Oh, no, it's Federal. I take it back. It's Federal Auto Match. That's the stuff that I've been buying because it's the cheapest 22 I can find. Accuracy-wise, I'm going to have a hard time shooting more accurately than that ammo offhand at 25 to 50 yards. I'm going to really struggle to shoot a 3-inch group. That's going to be rough. I'm not sure I can, at least not yet.
Well, I was shooting on a 6-inch head plate. I was doing a walkback drill with that 22-45, and I limited out at 85 yards. So I'm getting hits at 85 yards. Now I'm shooting two hands. I'm not, you don't have to time me with a sundial, but I'm not screaming through it. But you think about that, that's more than accurate with just basic ammo that we buy at Walmart in an off-the-shelf pistol.
That's a 6-inch head plate at 85 yards.
Yeah, and for the listeners, I'm doing that I'm running a slowly getting into the 21st century, and I'm playing with a red dot optic on that. I keep red dots on all my carbines, and it's a great tool. That's another discussion for another day, but there are some guns out there, and let's talk about that for a minute. The first name that comes up in my mind is Ruger. I mean, how Ruger has been able to produce guns that are that reliable. I mean, they cracked the code on that.
I don't understand how they're able to produce, because you have to understand, folks, the 2245 is a Mark IV. Mark IIs and Mark Is of the same pistol variety had more of a Luger-style grip. They're very accurate guns, horrendously accurate. But to clean one, you need 3 hands and a chicken to sacrifice to a god of your choosing to get this thing apart and back together again. With a 2245, I was doing my research because I wanted a really good 22, and going back and forth, looking around, and I saw somebody do a disassembly of a 2245, and I didn't believe it. It's very similar to an AR. You push one button, and the serialized section, the actual metal tube, comes off of the polymer frame, and you can blow it out with an air compressor.
Well, and that's important, because in this day and age, if you're shooting with a suppressor, you're going to blow a lot of crud back into the action of your pistol. You just are.
I could put 2 or 3, I want to say I could put at least 1,000 rounds through a 2245 without lubing it. And then that's when I start having issues. I'll squirt more lube in there, and I could probably get another 500 rounds, maybe. And that's assuming it has a can on there, and you're not actually blowing all this stuff out of there. You could probably go even longer without a real cleaning if you just lube it and don't use a suppressor.
But the benefit of that Mark IV design is
It's
you
easy to
literally
clean.
can take that upper off, pull it apart, clean it. And I mean, is it white glove, Marine Sergeant, happy, clean? No. But you get all the big chunks out and you drive on. I got better things to do than spend forever perseverating over cleaning the damn gun. I just want it so it runs.
And it's a training tool. It's not my carry gun. I'll keep my carry guns clean and lubed. It's a training gun. If there isn't black stuff dripping out of the chamber when I lube it, you're not using it enough.
Like our good friend Dan Smith once said, I lube the gun when the slide slows down.
We had that conversation when I was doing that 9,000 round, hell run, and I was shooting, and you look at me and go, "Hey, when's the last time you cleaned that gun?" I'm like, I haven't cleaned it yet. And you're looking at me like, dude, that's a Mark II. We should probably clean that. And I'm like, I'll clean it when it slows down. Because at that point, okay, it's actually dirty enough that it's worth going in and, sacrificing a good chicken to, whatever god of your choosing to get this thing pulled apart and put back together again.
That said, unlike centerfire guns, 22s can get a little bit more finicky if they're real dirty. And the Mark IV Mark IV is a great tool. You can take it apart and clean it a little more frequently.
It's easy.
I do it with a couple Q-tips when I come in when I'm done training, and a brush and drive on. I would also say, like, if you look at rifles, I've used the CMMG conversions or the 22 uppers on ARs.
Oh man,
the
awesome.
stainless, the versions with the stainless bolts run real well. I would also tell you, and it's not an AR, but if you want to work on rifle stuff, the Ruger 1022, especially if you put a decent aftermarket trigger in it.
Volquartsen makes a great trigger.
Yes.
I had an opportunity to try at friends that had one. It was probably worth more than the gun, at least because he bought that 22 ages ago. But he dropped a Volquartsen in. If somehow he got a good deal on it. And I shot it and went, oh man, there's another one I need to add to my pile. I really like this.
Yeah, well, and you know what? That's one of the things for our listeners. I decided I need to become a better rifleman. I've been primarily a handgun shooter, and most of the stuff as I went through the Bureau, it was 0 to 50 yards. You're using it in a defensive context, and that's fine. But living in the West, you want to hunt, you want to do things. Well, being able to shoot a rifle is important to me. So you want to learn how to run slings and do all that? Get a 22 and go start practicing. You can get a bunch of that. And especially if you're running a bolt gun, recoil control is almost not an issue.
Right.
Because you're going to rock, by the recoil will be absorbed, and by the time you get the bolt worked over, it's not like you're trying to shoot quickly with an AR.
Right.
So I'm just trying to think, what else do we need to... the 2245s are good. I've heard good things about some of the Smith & Wessons and like the newer, I think they're called Victory 22s. I like the old Model 41s, but they're sort of limited to standard Vel ammo, and that's sort of...
Kind of finicky.
Yeah.
Because if you run...
target guns.
Yeah.
I've heard some decent things about the new SIG. I think it's P322. It's like a...
Oh, it's their plastic striker fired gun.
Right.
I've heard good things. Oh, it's not Buckheimer. It's not Buckmaster.
Oh, the Browning.
Yes. What is that one?
Buckmarks.
Buckmark. Thank you. I've heard really good things about Buckmarks. There's tons of decent 22s floating out in the market. If you want a 22 revolver, that's going to be a little bit harder to come by cheaply. Again, Ruger, Smith, they always produce good stuff.
Ruger started making a GP100 in a 10-shot 22.
Really?
If I was going to buy a Ruger revolver, that's probably what I'd do. I mean, I understand they have the LCRs, the little pocket guns, and I get all that. But if I like Ruger revolvers. If I would run one and I wanted an understudy, I'd look hard at getting one of those.
Mm-hmm.
Because as much as bomb-proof as the big Rugers are, the centerfire, the 22's got to be even better. Although revolvers seem to have more issues with rough chambers or extraction issues. So At any rate, I would look at something like that. And again, I think there are just different ways to use the gun as a tool. And so you have to explore it. And one of the things that, again, one of my first mentors, Dan Smith, said is, don't believe anything else anybody says. Go try it on your own. Mm-hmm. And I remember Dan using a 22 Ace conversion on a 1911, and before he was getting ready for the practical shooting. And this is back in the dark ages.
Back when dinosaurs walked the face of the earth.
Right, and shooting IPSC or before, the old style IPSC, even before it turned into USPSA. And he used a 22 conversion on a 1911 and shot, I think it was like 50,000 rounds in a winter.
Dear God.
And got grooved in so well that he did really well and never looked back.
Yeah.
So you can do a lot with the 22s, and I would urge people to think hard about it. I would also tell people you ought to think about buying quality gear.
It's worth with a 22. You can perhaps not have top tier like you would with a carry gun, right. But don't buy the cheapest 22 you can find either. I mean, really take your time and do your research. Really find something that'll work for you,
and preferably buy it with adjustable sights, good adjustable sights.
Oh my gosh!
So you can really zero the gun, because there's nothing worse than having somebody struggle to shoot, and then you ask them, "Have you zeroed your gun?" and they look at you
like they don't even know what zeroing means, and you're like,
right.
"Oh, okay, we gotta take a step back here."
And on the other end of that, I'm amazed at the capability. Like I said, that Mark IV 22-45 with a dot optic.
I shoot that gun more than anything else in my collection.
And the accuracy and it's like it's a two-handed rifle. It's amazing how accurate it is at distance.
I was getting hits at 100 on a 6-inch head plate. Now, granted, it took a magazine or two. With even, the dot we're using is one of the very first gen Doctor optics, so it has 7 MOA.
Yeah, I think smaller makes better sense.
You're basically covering up the 6-inch head plate at 100, and you're like, well, I think this is where it's supposed to be.
A smaller MOA dot, and if you could find one, there's dots that you can reduce the intensity on.
Yeah, that's kind of important.
But, if you're a small game hunter, and I just don't see as much small game in the woods out west, but a small game pistol, if you're in a place where you're legally allowed to hunt.
A 22-45 in a can?
Even without the can. I mean, you can put that in the Hill People bag and,
Oh, yeah.
Put a lot of, grouse, ptarmigan, whatever, in the cook pot. Again, assuming it's all legal wherever you're doing this. It's a very, very capable tool. It is.
When I bought it, I kept going back and forth because I knew I wanted a Ruger because I had learned to shoot on a Mark II. I ended up picking up a Mark IV, and I'm like, well, it has a 1911 grip frame. It's a little bit. I'm a 1911 guy. 2 World Wars. And yes, I know I'm going to catch a lot of heat for that. I'm a FUD that's 25 years old. Okay, but
sometimes the old ways are the best.
Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. But
and for our listeners, what movie is that from?
Oh, I should know this. Oh, this hurts. I know it's
a reference to Idaho. Skyfall.
Oh, it's Skyfall. And when my dad says Skyfall has a reference to Idaho, it's James Bond's family's rifle collection went to a collector in Idaho, which we watched the movie when we lived in Idaho at the time, and I have never heard a movie theater laugh that loud before in that serious a movie. It was fantastic. Irregardless, I cannot recommend a really good 22 enough. They're cheap. They can be very accurate for what they are. And honestly, out of everything that I shoot, I have bolt guns, I have ARs, I have every flavor of pistol that I can think of. I shoot a 22-45, probably the most. And by the way, we are not plugging Ruger. We're not getting paid by Ruger. We just like to recognize products that really are very good, and the 2245, in my opinion, is probably one of the best 22 pistols on the market.
The other thing I would tell people to think about is don't. A lot of people get wrapped into the idea of buying the newest and latest and greatest and all that. There are some exceptional older pistols.
Oh, yeah.
The Colt Woodsman series.
Oh, man, those are nice.
Big money. You know,
but if Grandpapa hands you one in a will and you're like, oh, I should get a 2245. No, you should probably burn the barrel out on that Woodsman.
Exactly.
It'll shoot just as well.
I mean, it's like and I will never forgive myself. When I was in college, I had a chance to buy 2 Colt Diamondback revolvers, consecutively serial numbered, in 22 rimfire with 2.5-inch barrels, for $260 a piece. And I passed because
everyone's got a story like that.
In a while. But the other unsung hero that I would tell readers to take a real hard look at are the Beretta 71 series pistols.
They're creeping up in price, but that was when I talked about the Israelis earlier. They played around with the 70Ss and the 71s, and at one point I was doing some research. I write books on the side, so I'll just quietly self-plug myself here, shamelessly. But I was asking, like, hey, if I wanted a 22 that, could basically break a light bulb at 25 yards, what would you pick? And, of course, there is no really good option for that most of the time. At least it was a while ago. In the time frame I was looking at, it wouldn't work. But this friend of mine handed me a Beretta 70, and I've never been a fan of Berettas. I always was, I always poo-pooed the 92 system. And I got handed this one, and it's essentially a 1911 in 22 that functions. And I started shooting it, and I went, so how do I go about getting one of these?
Well, and so our listeners understand, it's a 16-ounce. It's an alloy frame 22.
71s are alloy framed.
The 71s are alloy framed, aluminum framed, single stack, thumb safety 22s, and essentially it's a Beretta 1911 that fits in your pocket. I mean, they're incredible guns. They brought there were a bunch of imported in the U.S. a few years back with the fake suppressors on them,
which was god awful.
And I've shot that gun, and those things are stupidly reliable. Even with you get the Triple K, the aftermarket mags, they run like a sewing machine. They're accurate. Big fan of that. So
I wouldn't say they're as accurate as a 2245 with fixed sights.
Probably not.
But for a pocket gun that sized, I was shocked how well it shot.
Yes.
Because I'm always very suspicious of pocket guns, just as a general rule. And then I got handed one of these, and I was like, oh wow, okay.
Well, and most of those tiny guns are so tiny for our hand size. It's like it just and listeners have to understand, I have a hard time getting into double XL size gloves. And so this gun fits. I'm amazed. It's that sweet spot. It's like the old HKP7.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's that weird intersection of ergonomics and design and features. And it's like the 1911.
2 World Wars!
Or the Browning High Power. But for all of our listeners who are not stuck in the 1950s, it'd be like a Glock 19.
Yes.
Just so you understand.
It fits good and it shoots well. It fits the way as, I was going to say as God intended, but,
And it's too bad Beretta doesn't make them anymore.
Which is sad because they would sell so many of them.
Right.
Oh, I'd buy a new one.
Right.
Just so I could have 2.
I think they've made later versions like the 87, which is a target gun, but this was a really cool pistol.
The other one, it's not in 22, so it's a little bit off topic, but they did make Beretta 70s and Beretta 84Bs, double Bs, and something else in 380.
Right.
And they're basically the same gun, just chambered in a larger cartridge.
Right.
So very cool and sweet and all that stuff. But in terms of 22s, I think we've sort of run up the clock on what exactly we can talk about and what 22 is really good for. Oh, another thing, folks. One quick thing. Buying if you're going to buy 22 for self-defense, I understand like me, like a lot of people, your first choice is, oh, they have a hollow point. We'll buy this one. I'm going to be honest. I have rarely, if ever, seen a 22 long rifle expand. I've seen multiple ballistics tests, and I really haven't seen that much expansion. So just keep that in mind, that if you do shoot something that is made of fleshy tissue, it may not actually expand at all. You're usually not going fast enough.
Well, years ago, there was an inventor that developed something called the Haned, Hanned bullet die. And what it is, you put a 22 into a hardened steel cylinder and you use the file to file off the tip to produce what's called the small game bullet profile. Basically a flat-nosed 22. Some go further, it's almost like a wad cutter. The point is that tends to penetrate pretty well and have more shock. But again, you're shooting something with a 22.
It's a 40-grain bullet.
Yeah, you know what? Accurate placement is what wins.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing I would tell you, if you're going to do a defensive use of a 22, shoot the gun a bunch.
Really break it
and
in.
make sure it really works.
Other than that, Dad, is there anything else that we need to cover with the 22, or is that pretty much the size of this episode?
I think we've covered the waterfront on the 22. I hope our readers or listeners enjoy this and get something out of it. I'd like to thank them for tuning in today and listening to some of our thoughts on the benefits of a 22.
I'd like to do the same. Folks, we'll be back with another episode here pretty soon. Stay tuned. And above all, practice the fundamentals.
Folks, that concludes today's podcast. We'd like to thank you for joining us at The Fundamental Shootist, the podcast produced by our company, SAC Tactical. For comments or questions, please reach out to us via our email, which is info@saconsco.com. For more cool content and to see schedules and upcoming classes and other neat things, please check out our website at www.saconsco.com. The Fundamental Shootist is a production of SAC Tactical, a division of SA Consulting, LLC. The information conveyed by this podcast is for educational purposes only. The principals, partners, guests, affiliates, or associates of the Fundamental Shootist and SAC Tactical are not responsible nor liable for any action taken based upon the information conveyed in this shared podcast. Always take proper precautions. Always follow all firearms safety rules. Always seek training from qualified, competent firearms instructors before using firearms. Have access to medical professionals when conducting live fire firearms training. Legal content, commentary, or explanations do not constitute legal advice, nor should they be viewed as legal advice. We are not your attorney. We recommend that you consult with competent legal counsel when researching and trying to understand laws and legal applications. All rights reserved.